the sky over the valley is still a bruised purple-grey. Somewhere below, smoke curls up from a rooftop, thin and grey against the cold morning air. There's no glass in the windows because there are no windows, just small openings near the ceiling, letting in the first hints of light. Somewhere close, a goat bleats. A child coughs. Someone is already awake, moving quietly across a packed earth floor, careful not to wake the others sleeping just a few feet away. This is a village 9,000 years ago. No street signs, no calendars, no clocks. Just people waking up in the dark, doing what people have done every single morning since the beginning of settled life. Getting up, starting the fire, facing the day. And here's the question that should stop you in your tracks. What did they actually do with that day? Not the textbook answer. Not the museum plaque summary. The real, lived hour-by-hour experience of being one of the very first humans to give up the wandering life and settle down permanently in one place. Because that's what makes this moment in history so strange. For hundreds of thousands of years our ancestors moved. They followed herds, followed seasons, followed rivers. Then, somewhere around 10 or 11,000 years ago, in a handful of places scattered across the ancient world, people stopped. They built walls, they planted seeds, they stayed. And in doing that, they invented something the world had never seen before, the village. We're talking about places like Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, where thousands of people lived crammed together in mud-brick houses with no streets between them, walking across rooftops to get from home to home. We're talking about early settlements in the Fertile Crescent, where wild grasses were slowly, patiently transformed into the wheat and barley that would eventually feed empires. This is the world we're stepping into today. Over the next while, we're going to walk through an entire day in one of these early villages. We'll wake up inside those mud brick homes and figure out how they were built and why they were shaped the way they were. We'll sit down to breakfast and ask what these people actually ate and how farming these first crops really worked. We'll follow the herds of sheep and goats out to pasture. We'll watch families divide their labour, raise their children, bury their dead, and maybe, just maybe, worship something we can only guess at. Now, I have to be honest with you up front. Nobody has a diary from 9,000 years ago. There's no eyewitness account, no first-person testimony. What we have is bones, pottery, seeds, footprints pressed into ancient clay, and decades of careful archaeological work. So, some of what you're about to hear is solid evidence, and some of it is educated speculation, archaeologists piecing together the most likely story from fragments left behind. I'll try to be clear about which is which as we go. If you're settling in for this one, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now for you. I love seeing these come in. Tokyo at midnight, Chicago at lunch, all scattered across the same story at completely different hours. And if you'd rather listen without any music or ads interrupting the journey, I've got a version just for that. Follow me on Spotify. Links in the description. All right. Let's step back into that quiet, smoky room and see who's about to wake up. Before we can watch anyone wake up, cook breakfast, or herd goats, we need to understand where we actually are and how we got here. Because this moment, humans building permanent homes and staying put, wasn't inevitable. For roughly 300,000 years, anatomically modern humans existed on this planet without a single permanent village. Not one. And then, in a geological blink, everything changed. So let's build the map first. Let's understand the timeline. And let's talk about why, after hundreds of thousands of years of moving, our ancestors suddenly decided to stop. The story centres on a region archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, a broad arc of land curving through what's now Iraq, Syria, southeastern Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. Picture a crescent moon lying on its side, one tip touching the Persian Gulf, the other reaching toward the Mediterranean. This wasn't some random patch of dirt. This was one of the most biologically generous regions on Earth, home to wild wheat, wild barley, wild lentils, wild chickpeas, and herds of wild sheep, goats, and cattle, all living in overlapping ranges. Nowhere else on the planet had this exact combination of domesticable plants and animals clustered so conveniently close together. It's almost as if the region was custom built for exactly what was about to happen. Now, the timeline. We're talking about a transition that begins roughly 12,000 years ago and really solidifies by about 10,000 years ago. Archaeologists call this shift the Neolithic Revolution, though revolution might be a misleading word. This wasn't an overnight event. It wasn't a single village waking up one morning and deciding, let's invent agriculture today. It was slow, uneven, and it happened at different speeds in different places. Some groups were farming and living in permanent settlements, while not far away, other groups were still hunting and gathering exactly like their ancestors had for millennia. For a long stretch of time, these two ways of life existed side by side. Let's talk about some of the actual places, because these aren't abstract concepts. These are real dirt, real walls, real evidence you can visit today. Jericho in the Jordan Valley is one of the oldest known settlements on Earth, with evidence of permanent occupation stretching back over 11,000 years. We're talking about a massive stone tower still standing today, over 8 meters tall, built by people who had no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals to help haul the stones, just human muscle, cooperation, and an enormous amount of time. Then there's Çatalhöyük, which we mentioned briefly already, a sprawling settlement in central Turkey that would eventually house thousands of people packed into mud-brick houses with rooftop entrances instead of streets. We'll spend a lot more time there later in this video because it gives archaeologists an incredibly detailed window into daily life. But for now, just know it represents village life at a later, more developed stage, roughly 9,000 years ago, sitting right in the time frame we're exploring. And there's Çatalhöyük in southeastern Turkey, a site that shows some of the earliest evidence of domesticated plants and animals working together in the same community, alongside surprisingly sophisticated architecture and even evidence of early metalworking experiments using copper. Çatalhöyük is a reminder that these early villages weren't primitive by any measure. These were innovative, adaptive communities, figuring out entirely new ways of living through trial, error, and generations of accumulated knowledge. So why here? Why now? Why did people who had successfully survived as nomadic foragers for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly decide that staying put was worth the risks? Archaeologists generally point to a combination of factors, and this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because we're still debating exactly how these pieces fit together. The first piece is climate. Around 11,700 years ago, the Earth transitioned out of the Younger Dryas, a sudden and brutal cold snap that had gripped much of the planet for over 1,000 years. When that cold period ended, the climate in the Fertile Crescent became warmer and wetter, creating ideal conditions for wild cereal grasses to flourish across huge stretches of land. Suddenly there was food, reliable, abundant, seasonal food, concentrated in specific locations. That leads to the second piece, abundance. When wild wheat and barley grow densely enough in one place, foraging for them doesn't require wandering. It requires staying. Why walk away from a valley that's producing more food than you could possibly carry when you could just stay, harvest it, store it, and come back next season? Some researchers believe this abundance essentially made permanent settlement the path of least resistance at least at first. People weren't necessarily choosing farming as we think of it today. They were choosing to stay near reliable food sources, and farming sort of emerged gradually out of that decision, almost as a side effect of sticking around long enough to start managing the plants they depended on. But there's a third piece too, one that's less about environment and more about people, social factors. Some archaeologists argue that settling down wasn't purely a response to ecological opportunity. It may have also been driven by social ambition, the desire to build something lasting, to create communal spaces for ritual and gathering, to establish territory and identity in a way that nomadic life simply didn't allow. There's intriguing evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe, not far from Şahinözü, suggesting that large-scale ceremonial construction may have actually predated full-scale farming, hinting that the desire to gather and build communal monuments might have helped drive the shift toward permanent settlement, rather than the other way around. It's one of the great ongoing debates in archaeology. Did farming create villages, or did the desire to build villages help create farming? Honestly, we may never fully untangle which came first, and that ambiguity is part of what makes this period so endlessly compelling to study. Now, how do we actually know any of this? How do archaeologists reconstruct daily life from sites that are thousands of years old, with no written records, no diaries, nothing anyone ever intended to leave behind as a message to the future? The answer is patient, painstaking detective work. Excavation reveals the layout of homes, the placement of hearths, the presence of storage pits. Residue analysis, examining microscopic traces left on pottery and tools, can reveal exactly what foods were cooked, what liquids were stored, sometimes even what medicines or intoxicants were used. Pollen analysis and plant remains tell us what was growing nearby and what people were harvesting. Animal bones, when studied carefully, reveal butchering patterns, herd management strategies, even the age and sex ratios of domesticated animals, clues that tell us how people were managing their herds over generations. Isotope analysis of human bones can reveal diet, migration patterns, sometimes even indicators of health and nutritional stress. Every single one of these methods is like a puzzle piece, and archaeologists spend entire careers fitting these pieces together, always aware that new evidence might completely reshape the picture. So, as we walk through this day in a Neolithic village, understand that we are reconstructing this from thousands of tiny clues, not from certainty. Archaeologists disagree constantly about interpretation, about timelines, about how to read the evidence. I'll try to flag those disagreements as we go because I think the uncertainty is part of what makes this so much fun to explore. And here's the tease before we move forward. Settling down sounds like comfort, right? Permanent homes, reliable food, community. But the archaeological evidence tells a more complicated story. Skeletons from these early villages show new patterns of disease, malnutrition, and physical stress that hunter-gatherers rarely experienced. Farming didn't necessarily mean an easier life. In many ways, it may have meant a harder one. We'll get into exactly why later, but for now, let's step back into that quiet mud-brick house and see what actually happens when the sun comes up. You don't wake up to an alarm clock, you wake up to light. In a Neolithic village, morning doesn't arrive as a number on a screen. It seeps in slowly as a dull grey glow filtering through smoke holes, doorways, and the cracks where mud brick has shrunk just a little since it dried. Your day begins when the sky says so, and that sky changes everything. Archaeologists think wake times in these early villages were tightly tuned to sunlight and season. In the long days of late spring and summer, people were probably up very early, squeezing every usable hour out of the cooler morning before the heat built over bare hills and open fields. In winter, with shorter days and biting cold, mornings may have started later, with people lingering near the warmth of the hearth. Not because they were lazy, but because hauling yourself into freezing dark to do fieldwork that couldn't be done yet made no sense. Inside a typical mudbrick house, there's no separate bedroom waiting behind a hinged door. These are single-room or few-room structures, multi-purpose spaces where sleeping, cooking, eating, and working all overlap. Excavations across the Fertile Crescent show raised platforms built along the walls, plastered smooth and often carefully maintained. We think these platforms were where people slept, sat, and stored important items all in one. Try to imagine it. You're not in a soft, private bed. You're on a firm plaster platform covered with mats, and maybe reed or woolen bedding, sharing the space with siblings, parents, maybe a grandparent, sometimes a baby bundled close to its mother. There might be 2 or 3 platforms arranged along the walls, slightly different heights, perhaps signalling different uses. Some show traces of repeated burning or staining, others are spotless. Archaeologists argue about the exact layout, were certain platforms primarily for sleeping, others for working, still others for burials. But the overall picture is clear. This is shared living, not individualized, door-closable privacy. And underneath that shared sleep, there's continuity. At some sites, including Çatalhöyük, we know that people buried their dead right under those platforms. Skeletons have been found tucked beneath the floors where people slept and sat every day. So, when you roll over in the faint dawn light, stretch your legs, and plant your feet on the plaster, you might literally be standing over your grandparents. The living and the dead sharing the same cubic meters of space, night after night. Now, if we zoom into Çatalhöyük specifically, mornings start in an even stranger way, at least by our standards. This was a village without streets. No lanes, no alleys, just dense clusters of houses pressed wall to wall. Archaeologists believe most movement happened over the roofs. That means your front door is actually your roof hatch. So your morning begins not by walking down a hallway, but by climbing down a ladder. You've been sleeping on that raised platform near the hearth, in a room with no ground-level doors and very few windows, if any. The room is dim, the air still holds yesterday's smoke and the smell of ash and drying dung fuel. Above you there's an opening in the ceiling, maybe covered at night, maybe partially open to let the smoke escape. When it's time to start the day, someone in the house uncovers that opening, checks the weather, lets the first real shafts of morning light pierce the darkness. Cool air drops in. A faint breeze stirs the fine dust that coats every surface. You climb to the roof first thing, or last, depending on your nighttime routine. Some archaeologists think people at Çatalhöyük spent a lot of their evening and early morning time up there, tending fires, doing chores, socializing, only coming down into the enclosed room to sleep. Others argue the interior was the primary living space, and the roof was more like a street. Either way, that ladder is your daily threshold. Up and down, out and in. As you descend in the morning carrying a basket or a newborn, or last night's embers in a clay container, you're met by a very specific sensory world. We can't record it, but we can reconstruct parts of it. The smell of wood smoke and charred cereal grains clings to the walls. Residue analysis from hearths and pottery shows that people were cooking grains into porridge and bread, legumes into stews, meat roasted or boiled. That means scorched flour dusted across platforms, the faint sourness of old dough left in a corner, the sweetish tang of fermenting grain. Add to that the smell of animals if not inside the house itself, then very close by. Dung used as fuel, hides drying, wool stored near the sleeping area. It's a dense, layered smellscape, more barn than minimalist apartment. The sounds of the village in the early morning would have built gradually. First, the small noises inside your own house, someone stirring the embers in the hearth, scraping ash aside, to expose a few glowing coals saved from last night, a grinding stone starting up in the corner. As someone begins to crush grain, archaeologists have found these querns worn deep by years of daily use, often fixed in one place, suggesting repeated rhythmic labour that probably began early in the day. The low murmur of voices as people negotiate who's doing what, who's sick, who's hungry, who needs to go to the fields. Outside, over the roofline, other houses wake in a kind of staggered wave. We can infer this from the division of labour that shows up in skeletons and tools, tendons stressed from grinding, knees and backs worn from fieldwork, children's bones showing activity patterns that suggest they started chores early. A village like Çatalhöyük might have housed a few thousand people at its peak, which means that as light strengthens, the rooftop world would gradually fill with shuffling footsteps, muted conversations, a baby crying somewhere, a goat calling for its kid, dogs barking as they look for scraps. And it's seasonal. The sounds, the timing, even the feel of the air change month by month. In harvest season, mornings might start earlier and tenser, people heading out with sickles, anxious about rain, about wind, about whether the grain will hold. In winter you might hear more indoor work, the thud of weaving weights on a loom, the scraping of hides being processed, the coughs and sneezes of respiratory infections that we know were becoming more common in these crowded spaces. The light itself shifts with architecture. Many Neolithic houses have white plastered walls and floors, and we think that wasn't just aesthetic. When a narrow shaft of sunlight falls through a roof opening onto white plaster, it amplifies the brightness, turning what would otherwise be a cave into a usable workspace. That morning beam might mark where people sit to work, where children play under watchful eyes, where tools are laid out. Some archaeologists suspect that people used these regular light patterns, almost like a clock. When the sunlight hits this spot on the platform, it's time to start grinding. When it reaches that niche, it's time to take the animals out. But we have to be careful not to flatten this into a single experience. Daily life in these villages varied by household and by season. A family with more livestock might wake earlier to milk goats or sheep, their house noisier and smellier than the home of a household focused on crop processing or craft production. A house with a newborn or a sick elder might have a chaotic, bleary-eyed morning while their neighbours start the day with methodical routine. Wealth, status and connections probably mattered too. Some homes at sites like Çatalhöyük show more elaborate wall paintings, more imported obsidian, more carefully maintained plaster. People living in those spaces might have had different morning responsibilities, more coordination with allies or dependents, fewer hours spent on the heaviest manual labour. And then there's the question of choice versus obligation. In a world where sunrise is your alarm, sleeping in isn't really a thing unless you're ill, injured or socially powerful enough to let others carry your load. The skeletons from these villages show signs of chronic stress on joints and spines, consistent with people getting up and doing hard physical work, day after day, from a young age. So when we imagine that quiet, soft dawn in a mudbrick house, we should pair it with something else. The awareness, probably felt in every adult body, that the peace of morning is brief. As soon as that light reaches a certain point, the grind, literally and metaphorically, begins. For now, though, we're still in that liminal moment. The village is stirring, but the real workday hasn't fully hit. Fires are being coaxed back to life, grain is being measured out, children are rubbing sleep from their eyes. In the next part of our day, we'll stay right here inside these houses and look more closely at what it meant to call a mudbrick box home, how these structures were built, maintained and lived in, and what their walls can tell us about the people who woke up inside them every single morning. If you could peel back the roof you just climbed through and roll time backwards a bit, you'd see that your house isn't just a box you happen to live in. It's a project, a memory, a stack of decisions, repairs and rebuilds layered literally on top of each other. Start with the basic ingredient, mud. Archaeologists think most early village houses in the Fertile Crescent followed a similar recipe. You take river or floodplain sediment, mix it with water, straw, chopped chaff, maybe dung, and stomp it until it's a thick, sticky paste. Then you either press it into moulds to make bricks, or shape it by hand into loaves that dry in the sun. Those fibres, straw, chaff, dung, act like rebar binding the mud so it doesn't crack as much when it dries. This is not a quick job. To build a new house, your family and neighbours might need to shape thousands of bricks. Archaeologists see whole brick fields at some sites, areas littered with misfired or broken pieces that suggest large coordinated campaigns of building. A single household couldn't easily raise walls by themselves. You need many hands to mix, carry, stack, and smooth. We think house construction in these villages was a communal event, part work, party, part social obligation. You help your cousin's family one year, they help you the next. Once the bricks are ready, you lay them in courses, bonding them with more mud. Corners are crucial. Many excavated houses show carefully squared corners and surprisingly straight walls, hinting at some shared, taught knowledge of how to build a proper house. Timber, scarcer in some regions than in others, comes in as beams and posts. At Çatalhöyük, for example, archaeologists believe wooden beams spanned the rooms, supporting a flat roof made of reed mats, brushwood, and thick layers of packed mud on top. The roof is not just a lid, remember, it's your street, your workspace, your entrance. Then there's the plaster. Mud brick alone erodes quickly, especially when people and animals are constantly brushing past it. So once the heavy work is done, you start smoothing a finer mixture, lime plaster where technology allows, or very fine clay plaster elsewhere, over walls, floors, platforms, even built-in benches and niches. At some sites we see dozens, sometimes hundreds of plaster layers, one on top of another. Each layer is a weekend of labour, a season of care, a decision to keep this house, this exact footprint, going a little longer. Inside, your floor plan is simple but dense with meaning. Most houses are one or two main rooms. The hearth, your primary fire spot, is often tucked near the centre or against a wall, sometimes raised on its own little platform. Around it, the rest of life orbits. We see storage bins built into the floor or against walls, sometimes carefully plastered, sometimes reinforced with timber or basketry. These bins likely held grain, pulses, maybe dried fruits and nuts. They're not just cupboards, they're next month's survival. Raised platforms divide the space vertically. One might be used mostly for sleeping and sitting. Another, closer to the hearth, shows traces of burning and food residues, maybe a food preparation zone. Yet another might cover burials. Sometimes we find grinding stones fixed into the floor in one corner, suggesting a quasi-permanent kitchen station, while other parts of the room stayed relatively clean. So this single enclosed space is doing everything. It's your bedroom, kitchen, pantry, workshop, and ancestral shrine. We think furniture was minimal, maybe some baskets, low stools, movable mats. The architecture itself provides the structure of daily life. But a mud brick house is never finished. It's always soft at the edges, always needing attention. Smoke blackens the ceiling, heat cracks the plaster around the hearth. Daily traffic grinds dust into the floor. So you replaster, again and again. Think about that. Several times a year, perhaps at certain seasons, households would mix fresh plaster, patch cracks, renew the whiteness of walls and floors. Some archaeologists see this as purely practical maintenance. Others suggest it had a ritual side, a kind of cleansing and renewing of the home's body. Either way, it was labour-intensive, and it probably involved more than one pair of hands. Eventually, the repairs aren't enough. Walls bulge. Foundations slump. Maybe the roof timbers rot, or a fire damages the interior. In many Neolithic villages, the solution is surprisingly straightforward. You don't move away, you bury the problem. Archaeologists have uncovered thick tells, mounds made of generations of houses where people simply level the old structure and build a new one right on top. At Çatalhöyük, this happened again and again, so that the village rose upward over centuries, a honeycomb of dead houses under living ones. From a bird's eye view across time, it's a vertical city of ancestry, each new home literally built on the compacted mud, debris, and bones of the old. What does that say about ownership? We think houses weren't just anonymous shelters. There's evidence that certain plots were held by the same social group for generations. At Çatalhöyük, sequences of houses rebuilt on the same footprint often share distinctive layout, quirks, and similar types of wall decoration that hints at house-based lineages, what some anthropologists call house societies, where the house itself is an enduring social unit, outlasting any individual. Burials reinforce this idea. Many people were interred under house floors, especially under platforms. Adults, children, sometimes with grave goods. That suggests a strong link between particular families and particular houses. Your dead are here, under this floor, not scattered randomly. Inheritance might have meant inheriting the right to that buried history, that plot, that rooftop doorway into the world. At the same time, village life blurs strict private-public lines. In ultra-dense settlements like Çatalhöyük, houses share walls. Their exteriors are basically one continuous surface. There are no alleys. Your roof touches your neighbour's roof. You hear every cough, every argument, every grinding stone. Privacy exists inside in how you arrange your platforms and niches, who you allow down the ladder, what you choose to plaster over or display on the walls. But even that interior might not be purely yours. Some archaeologists argue that certain rooms functioned partly as communal or ritual spaces, used by a wider kin group, not just the nuclear family. Whatever the exact rules, one thing is clear from the bones and bricks. Building and keeping a house standing took serious effort, and nobody did it alone. Timber had to be cut and hauled, mud carried, bricks stacked, roofs patched after heavy rain. Every time a heavy plaster layer went on, every time a wall was raised in a single day before the mortar dried, it implied coordination, a dozen or more people acting in sync. When you think home in these first villages, don't picture a quiet private box dropped onto a landscape by a construction crew. Picture a living, slowly thickening organism of mud and memories, fed by the labour of relatives and neighbours, stitched into a dense fabric of shared walls and rooftop paths. It's in this shared, hard-won space that the next big question of the day plays out. What are you all eating, and how do you turn piles of grain and a smoking hearth into breakfast? Before the sun is fully up, you already know what kind of day it's going to be by the sounds drifting through the house. The rasping scrape of a quern stone, the soft thud of grain being poured from a storage bin, the crackle of yesterday's coals being coaxed back to life. Breakfast in one of the world's first villages doesn't come from a pantry of options. It comes from a very short list of things you've spent months nursing out of the soil. At the top of that list are the first real staples, einkorn wheat and barley. These aren't yet the pampered, high-yield crops of later civilizations, but archaeologists think they're already different from their wild ancestors. In wild stands, the seed heads shatter easily, scattering grain as soon as it's ripe. Great for the plant, terrible for people trying to harvest it. In early villages, charred grains and impressions in mud bricks suggest a shift. more non-shattering forms, where kernels hang on long enough to be gathered and threshed. That's artificial selection at work, even if nobody would have called it that. Alongside them are pulses, lentils above all, plus peas, chickpeas in some regions, burned seeds in hearth ash, residues inside storage bins, and the distinctive shapes of these pulses under the microscope tell us they were regular guests at the morning meal. Together, grains and pulses build a kind of nutritional partnership, cereal for calories, legumes for protein. But your diet isn't a monotone of wheat and lentil mush. We think people are still foraging, especially early on. Charred remains of wild pistachios, almonds, figs, and various seeds show up in the trash. Animal bones tell us meat, marrow, and fat, whether from hunted gazelle or early domesticated sheep and goats, still matter. The balance just shifts. Instead of wandering the landscape after food, more and more of your calories grow 10 steps away from your front door. Turning those hard little seeds into something edible is where the real morning work begins. Someone, often women in ethnographic parallels, but the archaeology doesn't let us assign it with certainty, settles at the grinding station. 2 stones, a flat lower slab fixed into the floor or a low platform, and a handheld upper stone. You pour a small pile of einkorn or barley onto the slab and start the familiar body-deep motion. Push, pull, push, pull. Over time, these stones wear into shallow basins, and microscopic analysis of their surfaces shows polish patterns consistent with grinding cereals, not just occasional seed crushing. The result is flour or coarse meal. What you do with it next depends on habit, season, and energy. Thin dough, quickly patted out and slapped onto hot stones or the inner wall of a clay-lined oven, gives you flatbread, maybe more like a chewy, smoky pancake than anything you'd recognize as a loaf. Thicker pastes might be buried in ash or tucked near the coals to bake more slowly. Alternatively, you might skip the baking and go straight to boiling. Residue analysis from early pottery in clay-lined pits suggests starchy mixtures, gruels or porridges were common. Under the microscope, the starch grains from cereals show damage consistent with wet cooking, not just dry roasting. We don't have Neolithic cookbooks, but we do have their kitchen accidents: charred crumbs clinging to hearths, carbonized dough stuck to the inside of ovens, microscopic plant residues inside pots, and on grinding stones. These are our recipe pages. At sites like Çatalhöyük and Jericho, burned food lumps contain mixtures of ground cereal and pulses, sometimes with tiny bone fragments or herb seeds. That hints at stews and mixed dishes, not just plain porridge. Compared to earlier foragers, this is both an upgrade and a downgrade. On the plus side, there's stability. Wild game herds can vanish, nuts fail, fruit trees skip a year. A field of domesticated einkorn, if you protect it from grazing animals and weed it a bit, is less likely to surprise you. Grain stores well, dried lentils and peas keep their value months after harvest. For the first time, you can look at a bin of food and see not just today's meal, but the whole winter. On the minus side, the menu narrows. Foraging groups typically ate dozens, maybe hundreds of plant species over a year, each with their own micronutrients. Early farmers, according to isotopic analysis of their bones, lean heavily on cereals. That's a lot of carbohydrates, not always balanced by enough protein or vitamins. Dental evidence backs this up. More cavities, more enamel wear from stone grit in the bread, signs of iron deficiency in some populations. You've traded variety for predictability, a wild salad bar for a dependable bowl of grain. Meal timing probably revolves around the rhythms of work and light. We think there's an early meal, what we'd call breakfast, built around leftovers. Yesterday's bread rewarmed, porridge thickened overnight. Maybe a handful of dried fruit or nuts, if it's still close to harvest season. Then a more substantial meal later in the day, once field work or herding is done. Evening might see another round at the hearth, a shared pot bread passed around, stories traded. Was this eating done as a nuclear family, each house on its own, or in larger communal groups? The evidence is mixed. Individual houses often contain their own hearths, ovens, and grinding stones, suggesting a basic unit of production and consumption centered on the household. But in some villages, we also see oversized structures with large ovens and multiple grinding installations that don't quite fit the scale of a single family. Archaeologists debate whether these are public kitchens, ritual feasting halls, or something in between. It's possible that day-to-day meals were mostly household affairs, punctuated by seasonal or ritual feasts that pulled many families together. Seasonality threads through everything you eat. Right after harvest, your bins are full and diet is richest. Fresh green pulses, newly threshed grain, maybe more meat as herds are culled to match winter grazing capacity. As months pass, meals lean harder on what stores best: dried cereals, dried legumes, dried fruit. Spring might bring a small foraged bonus. Early greens, wild seeds, maybe fish or birds exploiting seasonal wetlands before the new crops come in. So when you sit on that plastered platform in the soft light of morning, tearing off a piece of smoky flatbread or sipping a thick, grainy porridge, you're tasting more than breakfast. You're tasting a bet your village has made with the landscape. That controlled fields and stored grain can feed you more reliably than wandering ever could. The rest of your day, out in those fields, watching the sky, worrying about rain, pests and grazing animals, is going to be about making sure tomorrow's breakfast is even possible. Breakfast is only the end of a story that started months ago, out in the fields. Step outside the village and you won't see neat rectangles cut with plough furrows. There are no oxen dragging wooden beams, no iron blades biting deep into the soil. At 9,000 years ago in most early villages, those things don't exist yet. Instead, fields look a lot like slightly tamed wild patches. We think plot preparation starts small, a slope or a terrace near the village that seems promising, decent soil, not too stony, close enough to carry water if you have to. People clear the worst of the brush with stone axes and simple knives, maybe burn off the dried vegetation at the end of a season. Ash darkens the ground, adds a bit of fertility. The key tool isn't a plough. It's a stick. Archaeologists call them digging sticks or planting sticks. A sturdy piece of wood, fire-hardened at the tip, sometimes with a stone weight lashed on to give it more bite. You jab it into the soil, twist, pull, and you've opened a narrow hole or scratched a shallow furrow. Do that a few hundred times and you've planted a family plot. Do it a few thousand times across the community and you've planted a village. Planting itself is an exercise in patience and remembered experience. How deep do you push the einkorn grains? How far apart do you space the barley? The answers don't come from written manuals. They come from stories told around the hearth, from watching what worked last year and the year before. We think seed is precious, saved carefully from the previous harvest, maybe set aside in special containers. Using it feels like a small risk every time. You are literally burying your future food and hoping the clouds cooperate. Once the seeds are in, the real-time commitment starts. Without herbicides, weed control is you, your back and your hands. People walk the plots, especially in the early growing season, pulling up competing plants or cutting them back with simple blades. Archaeobotanical samples from early fields show both crop and weed seeds together, but over time, in some regions, the balance shifts toward fewer weeds, suggesting more intensive tending. That implies hours bent over, day after day, week after week, walking the same paths between rows. The relationship with rain becomes almost obsessive. Before farming, bad weather might push your group to move, to shift camp, to gamble on a different patch of land. Once you've invested months of labour in a fixed field, moving isn't so simple. A dry spell in early spring, a hailstorm at the wrong time, a freak frost, these aren't just inconveniences, they're existential threats. Pollen cores and sediment layers tell us that climate around this time is still variable. So every dark cloud, every change in wind becomes part of your mental calendar of risk. When the crops finally ripen, the village's most iconic farming tool comes out, the sickle. We find sickle blades as small curved inserts made of flint or obsidian, set into bone or wooden handles. Under the microscope, their edges show a distinctive sickle gloss, a polish produced by cutting huge amounts of silica-rich cereal stems. That sheen is the fossilized record of harvest days, line after line of people sweeping their arms through the standing grain, grabbing handfuls, slicing low, letting the stalks fall into bundles. Harvest is a sprint. Cereals don't ripen evenly. Birds and rodents are waiting. Storms can flatten mature grain. So for a short window, almost everyone who can work probably does. The rhythm of the year compresses into an urgent, repetitive motion. Cut, gather, tie, carry. Then comes drying, threshing, winnowing. More work, more stages, more time. All of that labour funnels into one goal: storage. You can't be a farmer without somewhere to put the surplus. Archaeologists uncover bell-shaped storage pits dug into house floors or courtyards, plastered bins along walls, sometimes separate silo-like structures. Grain impressions in the plaster and charred deposits at the bottom of these pits show they really did hold cereals and pulses, not just random junk. Storage pits are both security and vulnerability. Fill them, and you can ride out a bad winter or a missed hunting season. But if mould creeps in, if rodents find a way, if a fire runs through the village, months of work vanish. Burn layers in some Neolithic sites preserve whole caches of carbonized grain. Frozen moments when a household's food economy literally went up in smoke. And behind that, there's an even bigger risk: dependence. By this point, many villages lean heavily on a handful of species: einkorn, emmer, barley, lentils, peas. If disease hits one of these crops or a series of drought years hits the region, there's no easy way to just switch to some alternative wild plant set. The archaeobotanical record hints at occasional diversification. Flax here, maybe early experiments with rye or oats there, but the bulk of the calories come from the same narrow group. Farming stabilizes food in good years. It magnifies disaster in bad ones. Who actually controls these fields and storage spots is still debated. Some sites show houses with their own small bins and grinding stones, suggesting family-based plots, each household managing its own slice of land and its own stored grain. Other villages have evidence of larger communal buildings with big storage installations, sometimes more than any single family would need. That has led some archaeologists to argue for shared fields, or at least shared harvests, maybe certain crops or portions set aside for collective use, feasts or ritual. It's possible both systems coexist, individual households working particular plots, but bound into a web of obligations, seed loans, reciprocal labour at harvest, communal reserves for hard times. Land might not yet be private property in the later legal sense, but it's no longer the unmarked commons of roaming foragers either. Boundaries, not always fences but understood lines, are starting to matter. Farming quietly rewires how people think about time. Instead of a mostly flexible schedule following herds or ripening wild foods as they appear, your year is now locked to a crop cycle. There's a right week to plant, a right window to weed, a narrow band of days to harvest before the grains shatter or storms arrive. Miss those, and there is no catching up later. We think this creates a new mental calendar, one etched into bodies as much as minds. Children grow up knowing that certain months mean sore backs and little sleep, others mean hungry gaps before the new crop comes in. Rituals and gatherings start clustering around sowing and harvest. Time isn't just before the rains and after the gazelle migration anymore. It becomes this year's crop, last year's poor harvest, the good season 3 years back, out in those first fields with digging stick and sickle in hand. People aren't just tending plants. They're tending a new way of living, one where the village is chained to the seasons, and the seasons, for better or worse, decide what the village becomes. If crops tie the village to the soil, animals tie it to the hills. Walk away from the fields and up toward the rougher ground, stony slopes, scrubby bushes, places you can't easily poke full of planting stick holes, and you start to see another kind of Neolithic experiment. Sheep and goats. We think these are the first real livestock in many of these early villages of the Fertile Crescent. Not tame in the petting zoo sense, and not fully domesticated the way modern breeds are, but already pulled part way out of the wild system and into a human one. The process probably doesn't start with some genius announcing, "Let's invent herding." It begins with familiarity. Hunters know where the wild sheep and goats drink, where they shelter in bad weather, what paths they follow between grazing spots. Over generations, some groups start nudging this relationship. Maybe they drive herds into natural corrals to hunt more efficiently. Maybe they spare the females with young. Maybe they keep a few kids or lambs alive back at camp, feeding them scraps, getting used to their behavior. Archaeologists don't see that in a movie-style montage. They see it in bones. At some early sites, the remains of goats and sheep show a striking pattern. Lots of young males killed, more females allowed to grow old. In wild hunted herds, the age and sex distribution looks different. This skewed profile, repeated across layers, looks less like random hunting and more like deliberate herd management, keeping breeding females, culling surplus males. It's the bone version of a livestock ledger. Dung tells its own story. In several early villages, microscopic analysis of floors, alleys, and fills reveals compacted layers packed with herbivore droppings. Sometimes it's even visible as thick, dark lenses in the archaeological profile. These aren't occasional traces from a wild animal wandering through. They look like pens, like nights when sheep and goats were brought into the village for safety, their hooves and waste literally building up the ground people walked on. Once that relationship locks in, daily life changes. At dawn, while some people head to the fields with digging sticks and sickles, others drive animals out of the village enclosure. Early herding probably doesn't mean graceful lines of animals trailing behind a lone shepherd with a crook. It's messy. Kids dart off, goats test boundaries, dogs, already semi-domesticated partners from hunting days, help snap at heels, circle escapees back in. The tasks are simple to describe and exhausting to repeat. You walk a lot. You follow the animals to grazing patches that won't destroy your fields, to water sources that might be hours away, to patches of seasonal grass that green up just after the rains. You keep watch for predators, wolves, big cats, human raiders who might see animals as moving bags of meat and bone tools. You try to keep the herd from scattering into neighbouring groups' territory, because by now animals, like fields, have started to come with unspoken boundaries and claims. In many ethnographic herding societies, children and teenagers handle a big share of this work, and archaeologists suspect something similar here. If you're 10 or 12 in one of these early villages, you might already be spending long days on the slopes, responsible for dozens of animals that represent months of stored labour and calories. Small handprints in plastered floors at some sites, tiny clay animal figurines tucked into corners, and wear patterns on miniature-sized tools hint at children deeply involved in adult tasks. Herding is one of the few jobs where smaller bodies are actually an advantage. You're nimble, you eat less, you can move with the herd without needing to be back constantly for heavy field work. What do these animals give in return? At first, mostly meat and bones. Goats and sheep are walking larders. You can kill one when you need it, rather than trying to store huge volumes of hunted meat. Bone tools, hide for clothing in containers, sinew for binding, all become more predictable because the raw material is a breeding population just outside the village, not a lucky hunt. We think milk comes into the picture surprisingly early, though the evidence is subtle. Residue analysis from some Neolithic pottery shows fat signatures consistent with dairy and certain patterns in animal slaughter ages, more adults surviving, hint that people were keeping females alive not just for offspring but for ongoing production. Once people realize they can tap animals for milk, a new stream of calories opens up. Cheese or yogurt-like products, which keep longer and are easier to digest, might already be under quiet experimentation, even if we can't see them directly in the record. Wool, as in the thick fleeces of modern sheep, is probably a later development, but these early animals still offer hair and coarse fibre. Over time, selective breeding, often unconscious at first, shifts traits. People keep the animals that are calmer, that don't bolt so quickly, that produce just a bit more usable fibre or milk or meat for the same amount of grazing, generation after generation, that changes the herds. And then there are pigs. Pigs occupy a strange position in this story. They don't herd nicely over long distances, they don't give wool, and they're not much use as pack animals. But in and around some early villages, pig bones appear in large numbers with signs of domestication. Pigs are garbage processors and fat factories. They thrive near human settlements, eating scraps, rooting in refuse, turning waste into meat. Some archaeologists think pig keeping becomes a way to intensify food production right inside or on the edge of the village, trading mobility for efficiency. Cattle arrive later to the party. Early on, wild aurochs, massive dangerous cattle ancestors, are still mostly hunted. Their bones in early layers show the kind of trauma and age profiles you'd expect from difficult big game hunts. But over time, at some sites, we see shifts similar to sheep and goats. More controlled age distributions, more signs of individuals kept to adulthood. Horn cores shrink, body size gradually drops, suggesting domestication. For the first farmers in our 9,000-year-ago window, cattle might just be crossing from fearsome wild quarry to extremely valuable, occasionally controlled resource. Their meat, hides, and an enormous quantity of usable bone. True traction animals, oxen-pulling ploughs, probably belong to a slightly later stage, but the seeds of that relationship are being planted now every time someone keeps a calf instead of killing it, or tries tying one up instead of chasing it down. All of this animal management leaves a deep fingerprint on where people can live. Hunters can follow migrating herds across broad territories. Pure farmers are locked to their fields. Early herders sit somewhere in between. Sheep and goats like rough grazing land, slopes, uplands, marginal zones that crops can't easily use. Villages with substantial herds often cluster near that kind of mixed landscape, good enough soil for cereals close by, but also access to hills or steppe for grazing. We think some communities start experimenting with seasonal movement. Part of the group stays near the permanent houses and fields, while others take animals to distant pastures in certain months. Archaeologists see hints of this in small satellite sites with lots of animal bones and little architecture, or in isotopic signatures in teeth that suggest animals were moved through different environments across the year. So the daily schedule of the village splinters. Some people's time is ruled by sowing and harvest, others by grazing cycles and water holes. Children might know more about distant ridges and hidden springs than about the layout of every house in the village, because they spend their days on the move with bleating companions. Domesticated animals turn risk into routine. Instead of betting everything on the success of this year's hunt or this year's crop, you spread your chances. A bad harvest but good lambing season. A dry year when your goats still find shrubs on high ground. But they also introduce new dependencies and new vulnerabilities, disease that can sweep through a penned herd, overgrazing that can strip hillsides and send erosion washing toward your fields. In the shadow of those mudbrick walls among the bleats, grunts and lowing from pens, people are slowly learning that controlling animals is as complicated and as transformative as controlling plants. The village is no longer just a place where humans live. It's becoming a node in a much larger web of domesticated life, a partnership that will drag both people and animals into an entirely new kind of world. If animals tie the village to the hills, water ties everything to the valleys. Your day, everyone's day, is calibrated to where the water is and how hard it is to reach. Some of these early villages sit right next to rivers or perennial streams. Archaeologists think that's no accident. Reliable flowing water means you don't have to spend half your waking hours just hauling it. But rivers flood, shift course, dry to a trickle in bad years. So people hedge their bets. In a few sites we see the first hints of wells and deep pits dug down to the water table, lined with stone or plastered with mud. They're rough, nothing like the storybook Circle of Stones well. But they tell us something important. People aren't just taking what the landscape offers, they're probing it, engineering access to hidden water. Elsewhere, layers of silt and walls built along stream margins suggest channels and small embankments, early attempts to protect and guide seasonal flow. For you, living here 9,000 years ago, this isn't abstract hydrology. It's work. You might start the morning with a trip down a dusty path to fill heavy clay jars at the river before the sun climbs too high. If the nearest source is a seasonal spring half an hour away, that's an hour of walking with a painful load. Every single day, sometimes multiple times. Children and teenagers probably shoulder a lot of this burden. Their bones in some Neolithic cemeteries show stress patterns consistent with frequent carrying. Water is not just for drinking. It soaks grain for cooking, softens hides, tempers clay, cools hot stones, and washes the dust and dung from your skin. Every task that needs water has to be planned around when you can get it and how much you can spare. And then there are the tools you carry with you to make that water, that grain, that animal fat actually usable. Stone is still the cutting edge of technology here, and flint knapping is as specialized as any modern craft. Somewhere on the edge of the village, there's likely a place littered with shards and chips where someone spends hours striking flakes from carefully chosen cores. Archaeologists call these knappers experts because the waste they leave shows skill, precise angles, thin, parallel flakes, standardized shapes. Obsidian, when people can get it, is the high-tech import of the day. It doesn't occur everywhere. It comes from specific volcanic regions, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. Yet at many early villages we find razor-thin obsidian blades and microblades, so sharp that modern experimenters slice meat and plant fibers with them effortlessly. That means someone is moving this black glass across the landscape through trade, down-the-line exchange, or seasonal journeys, and specialists are learning how to work it without shattering it to useless gravel. Bone fills in the gaps where stone falls short. Once animals become a regular controlled resource, their skeletons turn into hardware stores. Long bones are split, ground and polished into awls for piercing hide, points for fishing or small game hunting, spatulas for applying plaster or smoothing clay. The glossy sheen and rounded wear on many of these tools tell of endless repetitive use, pushing through leather, sliding through woven fibres, scraping, prying, mending. None of these tools are disposable in the modern sense. Keeping a Neolithic toolkit going is a full-time background project. Edges dull after cutting cereal stalks or scraping hides. Tips snap, handles crack. So, part of each day for someone in the house is repair and maintenance. You sit by the doorway where the light is good, resharpening sickles with careful pressure flaking, rehafting broken blades into wooden handles with sticky plant resins and animal sinew, smoothing a cracked bone awl against a stone until it's usable again. Pottery changes this entire equation. Before fired clay pots, people rely on baskets, leather bags, wooden bowls and stone basins to carry and store things. These work, but each has limits. Baskets burn, hides rot, wood cracks, stone is heavy. When archaeologists start to find thick-walled, low-fired pots in these early villages, along with kilns or firing pits and heaps of wasters, misfired, cracked vessels, it signals a quiet revolution. With pottery, you can store surplus grain safe from rodents and insects in sealed jars. You can leave water standing in a corner of the house without it soaking through the container. You can simmer food in ways that weren't practical before. Long, slow boiling of grains, legumes and bones to extract every calorie and nutrient. Residue stuck to the inside of some of these vessels shows traces of cereals, pulses and animal fats. That suggests stews, porridges, broths, foods that soften tough plant tissues and make more of the animal edible. Pottery lets people turn marginal scraps into digestible meals. It also encourages people to think differently about time. You can cook larger batches, keep things overnight, plan for tomorrow instead of just today. Alongside pottery, older, more fragile technologies keep doing heavy lifting. Basketry rarely survives 9,000 years in the ground, but we catch it in negative, impressions of woven fibres left on clay, patterns in plaster floors that match basket bases, and occasionally beautifully preserved fragments in waterlogged or desert sites. These impressions show tight, complex weaves, different patterns for different uses, deep carrying baskets, flat trays for drying grain, covered containers. Textiles follow a similar ghost trail. Tiny clay loom weights, spindle whorls used to spin fibres and microscopic analysis of residues all point to people twisting plant fibres and animal hair into thread, then weaving or braiding it. Early cloth might be coarse, linen-like fabrics from flax, mats and coarse garments from reeds and grasses, rough hair from goats, but it's still an enormous leap from simple skins. Weaving isn't just a women's craft in some timeless stereotype. It's engineering with soft materials. You learn how different fibres behave when wet or dry, how much tension a warp thread can take before it snaps, what kind of weave makes a basket leak-proof versus breathable. Every success and failure is preserved in muscle memory and in the stories older people tell while hands keep moving. Which brings us to how all this knowledge survives. There are no manuals, no written instructions, but archaeologists believe there is an intense embodied apprenticeship system. Children watch adults nap stone, but they also practice on their own little cores. We find small clumsy flakes mixed in with expert debris. They get miniature tools, scaled down sickles or awls that fit their hands and let them join real work while they're still learning. Mistakes are cheap when you're working with stone and bone, but deadly when you're handling herds or fire, so fine motor skills are honed early. Techniques don't stay locked inside one family either. Obsidian blades of the same distinctive style show up across multiple villages. Similar pottery forms and surface treatments appear miles apart. That suggests people are sharing methods through marriage ties, visits, seasonal gatherings, or the movement of craftspeople themselves. Ideas like obsidian nodules travel. What sits in the background of all this is effort. Water doesn't appear in pots by magic. Someone walks for it. Sharp tools don't stay sharp. Someone sits hour after hour, coaxing edge after edge from stubborn stone. Baskets fray, pots crack, cords snap, and each failure demands time to remake and repair. The first villages are not just fields and animals and houses. They're maintenance machines powered by human hands, turning raw earth, bone and fibre into the technology that makes settled life barely possible. All this effort raises an obvious question. Who is actually doing what? If you drop into this village expecting a neat chart that says men fields, women house, children play, you're going to be disappointed. Archaeologists are too. The clues we have are scattered through bones, tools and patterns of wear, and none of them line up into a simple universal picture. Start with the bodies themselves. When bioarchaeologists look at Neolithic skeletons, they're not just counting teeth and measuring height. They're reading biographies written in bone. Repetitive motions leave signature damage, grooves where tendons have been overused, joint surfaces warped and polished by constant strain, tiny fractures that heal in distinctive ways. At several early farming sites, we see a striking pattern. Many adult female skeletons show intense wear in the shoulders, elbows and lower back, plus specific damage to the knees and toes. When researchers compare this to experiments with traditional grinding stones, a match pops out. Spending hours every day, kneeling or squatting, rocking a heavy upper stone over grain, loads those joints in exactly the same way. So when you picture the morning in this village, it's not wild speculation to imagine a line of people, often women, maybe some older children, moving grain back and forth over stone, turning yesterday's harvest into today's flour. Over years, that motion carves itself into their skeletons. But it's not as simple as saying only women grind grain. Only men farm. Male skeletons from some villages show their own pattern of stress. Robust upper arms, heavy muscle attachments in the shoulders and chest, spinal compression consistent with carrying loads or working with heavy tools. Some have healed fractures and trauma we might associate with hunting accidents or occasional violence. Others show wear in the hips and knees that matches hours of walking over uneven ground, herding perhaps, or moving between fields and village. Then it gets messier. At some sites, the grinding damage shows up on male skeletons too. At others, female bones bear marks of heavy outdoor labour. The deeper researchers look, the more variation they find. It suggests that while there were tendencies and expectations, they weren't hard rules carved into stone. Labour could and probably did shift with seasons, pregnancy, illness, age and sheer necessity. Children's bones add another layer. You might imagine childhood as a protected bubble, but Neolithic skeletons say otherwise. Even young teenagers show stress markers in the spine and knees that look like load carrying and repetitive labour. Some have tiny, well-developed muscle attachments in the forearms and hands, consistent with tasks like spinning fibres, shaping clay, or helping with small tools. Archaeologists think there's a kind of gradient of responsibility. Very small children are mostly carried, watched, entertained. As soon as they're physically able, they're folded into the work stream, fetching water in smaller vessels, guarding gardens from animals, scaring birds from fields, helping sort grain, or assisting with herding close to the village. By adolescence, they are, in practical terms, full workers. So where does specialization fit into all this? The concentration of flint-napping debris in one corner of a settlement, or clusters of misfired pots and kiln remains hint that some people spend much more time on certain tasks than others. You can imagine a few individuals in the village known for their beautiful blades, or their reliable pots that don't crack, or their ability to repair a sickle so it cuts better than new. Builders might also be semi-specialists, the skill to mix plaster so it doesn't crumble, to lay mud bricks so walls don't slump in the first heavy rain, to repair a collapsing roof. Those are not trivial talents. Archaeologists think certain lineages or households might have become associated with particular crafts, their knowledge flowing down generations. That doesn't mean anyone is exempt from basic survival work. Even if you're the best blade maker in the region, you still help at harvest. Even if you're renowned for weaving, you may still feed animals, fetch water, and tend a small plot. In a village where every calorie is hard-won, no one can afford to do only one thing all the time. This raises another big debate. Were these early villages more egalitarian than the farming societies that came later? Some researchers argue yes. They point out that grave goods in many Neolithic cemeteries are relatively modest and similar between men and women: beads, tools, a pot or two. House sizes in a single village often don't differ that dramatically. Iconic figurines that may represent women or goddesses appear widely, and some archaeologists have taken this as a sign of high female status or even matrilineal systems. Others are more cautious. They note that equality in graves doesn't automatically mean equality in life. The heavy strain on women's bones from grinding grain could indicate a gendered burden of monotonous, physically punishing work. Control over land, animals, and long-distance trade might have tilted toward adult men, even if it doesn't always show up clearly in the archaeology. Some see hints of emerging hierarchies tied to certain houses or lineages, with gender intersecting those differences in ways we can only partially reconstruct. And then there's the problem of translation. We keep reaching for modern categories: housewife, farmer, craftsman, child labour. But in a world where home, field and workshop all blur together, those lines don't really apply. Work is less a job title and more a shifting pattern of tasks that follow the seasons, the life cycle, and the rhythms of the village. In the end, what we can say is this: labour is divided, but not neatly boxed. Age matters, gender likely matters, skill and experience matter a lot. Early villages probably sit in a middle zone. More differentiation of roles than small foraging bands, but far less rigid hierarchy than later kingdoms and city-states. Standing inside one of these houses 9,000 years ago, you wouldn't see men's work and women's work as separate universes. You'd see a mesh of overlapping duties, passed hand to hand, body to body, from elders to children, from women to men, and back again, all bent toward a single, exhausting goal, keeping this fragile new experiment in settled life going for one more season. Step outside that one house and look at the village as a whole, and a different question comes into focus. Not just who does what work, but who matters more. Archaeologists have two favourite starting points for this: houses and graves. If there's a clear upper class, you'd expect to see it in obvious ways: big fancy buildings, rich burials loaded with goods, a few people literally living larger than everyone else. In many of the earliest farming villages, that pattern doesn't really show up. Take the famous case of Çatalhöyük in what's now central Turkey. This is centuries after the very first experiments in farming, but still early in village life. From above, the settlement looks like a dense patchwork of mud brick rectangles, jammed together with no streets, people moving across flat roofs instead of along alleyways. When archaeologists mapped those houses, they were expecting to find a big man house, a chief's residence, a temple that dwarfs the homes around it. What they found instead or houses that are, by and large, remarkably similar. Same general footprint, same style of plastered walls, same basic layout of platforms, hearths and storage. Yes, some houses are a bit larger, some are more elaborately decorated, some have more burials beneath the floors, but we don't see a crystal-clear split between elite mansions and poor shacks. The graves tell a similar story. At Çatalhöyük and at other early Neolithic sites, many people are buried under house floors, tucked beneath platforms where the living sit and sleep. Adults, children, men, women. Some are buried alone, others in clusters over generations. Grave goods exist, beads, stone tools, bone ornaments, but the differences are often subtle, not the stark rich-poor divide you see a few thousand years later in Bronze Age tombs stocked with gold, weapons and exotic imports. It's tempting to look at this and say, an egalitarian utopia. But the details complicate that picture. Certain houses at Çatalhöyük contain many more burials than others, and more wall paintings, more figurines, more carefully renewed plaster. Archaeologists think these might be history houses, places tied to particular lineages or ancestor cults. Being born into one of those houses may have carried status, even if it didn't come with a palace. Some skeletons also stand out. Rare individuals are buried with distinctive objects, obsidian mirrors, elaborate necklaces, decorated weapons. Not royal regalia, but perhaps markers of special roles. A skilled hunter, a renowned ritual specialist, a respected elder. So how did decisions actually get made in a village like this? We don't have meeting minutes or law codes yet, but we do have patterns. In small communities, maybe a few dozen to a few hundred people, everyone knows everyone else. Reputation is everything. Archaeologists and anthropologists think that in this scale of society, formal chiefs and kings are less necessary. Guidance likely comes from a mix of elders, successful household heads, and people with specialized knowledge. You can imagine evening gatherings where older men and women, people whose bones already carry a lifetime of work, argue quietly over when to plant, where to dig new storage pits, whether to move a herd to fresh pasture. There might be no official throne, but there are certainly voices that carry more weight. Conflict is inevitable in any close-packed village. Fields overlap. Irrigation channels can be blocked. Animals trample someone's crops. Marriage agreements go bad. Without a police force or written law, how do you stop a feud from tearing the place apart? Anthropologists studying later small-scale farming communities offer one likely answer. You don't rely on punishment alone, you rely on relationships. If every household is tied to others through marriage, shared work, and reciprocal gifts, then open conflict threatens everyone's safety. We think disputes might have been handled through mediated talks, compensation in grain or animals, or ritual reconciliation, bringing both sides into a shared ceremony that makes continued fighting socially dangerous. In other words, cooperation is enforced not by a king with soldiers, but by a crowd of neighbours who can remember every time you took more than your share. The contrast with later Bronze Age towns is sharp. Fast forward 2,000 or 3,000 years, and you're looking at settlements with massive public buildings, temples on platforms, defensive walls, and clearly stratified housing, big compounds for elites, cramped quarters for everyone else. Graves suddenly sort into have and have not. Some people buried with chariots, weapons, imported jewellery, others with almost nothing. By comparison, these early farming villages look flatter. Fewer visible differences in house size, fewer spectacular graves, no monumental palace-temple complexes looming over the rest. Power, such as it is, seems woven through households and kin groups rather than concentrated in a single ruler or class. Population size plays a big role in this. A village of 150 people can, in theory, sit everyone down in one place, and hash out big decisions, even if the process is messy. A town of 5,000 can't do that without inventing more formal offices, leaders, councils, priests, administrators, plus ways to enforce their decisions. Early villages sit just below that threshold where hierarchy becomes structurally necessary. So was there equality, not in the sense of everyone being the same, or having equal comfort and freedom. Some houses hold more ancestors, more symbols, more history. Some individuals are laid to rest with objects that hint at prestige. Gender, age, skill, and lineage almost certainly shaped who could speak, who could decide, and who had to listen. But compared to the rigid class systems that farming will eventually produce, the kings, the tax collectors, the hereditary nobles, these first villages look like a different world. A place where status is real but negotiable, where leadership is a role more than a throne, and where the social experiment of living together is still new enough that no one has yet figured out how to turn it into a permanent, unchallengeable hierarchy. If status and power are still a bit blurry in these early villages, one thing is absolutely everywhere, in every layer of floor plaster and every corner of every house: children. Not just because there are small skeletons under the floors, though there are plenty of those, but because the archaeological record is quietly full of kid-sized traces at sites like Çatalhöyük, Jericho, or the slightly earlier villages in the Levant. We don't just find big grinding stones and full-size sickles. We also find miniature versions, tiny clay figurines that were never meant to stand upright on an altar. Little stone beads that would fit a child's wrist better than an adult's. There are small, clumsy copies of adult tools, dolls of the tool world that archaeologists think might have been toys or training gear, or both. Some flint blades are so badly knapped that it's hard to imagine an experienced toolmaker producing them. They look like the work of someone learning, someone who has watched grown-ups do this 1,000 times, and is trying to copy it with still awkward hands. In other words, a kid. So what did childhood look like in the first villages? If we follow the clues, we don't get a picture of childhood as a separate, protected bubble the way it often is today. We get something more blended. Archaeologists and anthropologists studying traditional farming societies see a consistent pattern. Children learn by watching, then by helping, long before they're doing full adult work. We think the same was true 9,000 years ago. Imagine a toddler crawling around the packed earth floor while adults grind grain nearby. That child is hearing the rhythm of the stones, watching how hands move over the quern, absorbing the pattern. A few years later, they're given a smaller stone, not because anyone sat down and planned a curriculum, but because that's just what you do. You imitate the work that keeps everyone alive. By 6 or 7, children in many farming societies are already doing real tasks. Gathering firewood at the edges of the settlement, chasing birds away from ripening fields, carrying water in small containers, watching younger siblings while parents weed or tend animals. We think Neolithic children did something very similar. Small bodies woven into big jobs, their play constantly shading into practice. That learning by imitation works best in dense social webs, and early villages were almost certainly built on extended kin. A household in a mudbrick village isn't just a mum, dad, and 2 kids. The burials under floors and platforms often include several adults and many children, spanning generations. The patterns suggest that houses were long-lived lineages, not short-lived nuclear units. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, in-laws, people tied together not only by blood but by shared ancestors, literally beneath their feet. In that world, a child doesn't just belong to 2 parents. They belong to a house, a lineage. Many adults are theirs, not interchangeable, but collectively responsible. If one woman dies in childbirth, another in the house may nurse the baby. If a father is lost in a hunting accident, uncles and older cousins can step into mentoring roles. This spreads risk in a dangerous world, but it also spreads affection, attention, and discipline. Those dangers are not abstract. They're written in the bones. In many early farming cemeteries and underhouse burial clusters, children's graves are heartbreakingly common. In some samples, half or more of the individuals who died did so before reaching adulthood. Infant and toddler remains are everywhere, often in small pits cut into earlier floors, sometimes grouped near hearths or platforms where the living spent their days. Farming did not immediately make life safer for children. Villages concentrate people, animals, and waste in tight spaces. That means more exposure to disease. Diets heavy in a few cultivated grains can leave children vulnerable to malnutrition if harvests fail or if diets aren't well balanced. The bones of some Neolithic kids show signs of anemia, infection, and periodic growth disruptions, evidence of bodies pushed to their limits. And yet, the way these small bodies are buried tells us something about how much they mattered. Children are often placed carefully, curled on their sides, sometimes cradled in baskets or wrapped in mats. Tiny beads, shell ornaments, or a miniature tool might be placed with them. In a few cases, an adult is buried with a child arranged in their arms, or a child is tucked into the fill of a grave that already holds an ancestor, as if to link their short life to a longer chain. Archaeologists see this as more than simple disposal. It looks like grief, and also like recognition that even a short life deserves the same ritual care as a long one. If you're burying an infant under your sleeping platform, renewing the plaster over that spot year after year, you are literally building your daily life on remembered loss. Emotionally, childhood in the first villages may have been intense in both directions. On one hand, kids would have had extraordinary freedom of movement compared to many modern children. They roamed roofs and courtyards, squeezed between storage bins, slipped out to the village edges. Play and work blended. A game of throwing pebbles at a target trains the same muscles you'll need to hurl a sling stone at a wolf. Tag between houses becomes rehearsal for navigating the tight maze of roofs and ladders. On the other hand, every adult over 30 would carry a mental map of graves. Every birth came with the knowledge that survival to adulthood was not guaranteed. That kind of background awareness can shape a culture. It might make people more emotionally cautious, or it might make each surviving child ferociously loved, wrapped in stories, songs, and constant guidance, because everyone knows how fragile they are. We get a glimpse of that emotional world in the objects left behind. A small clay animal worn smooth by many hands, a tiny, use-worn spindle wall that could only have belonged to a beginner, child-sized footprints preserved in ancient floors. These aren't just data points. They're moments in which children were not silent extras in the adult story, but active participants, laughing, failing, trying again, absorbing the skills and beliefs that held the village together. If you want to dive deeper into what we can recover of those inner worlds, what people feared, hoped, and whispered about in the dark, there's a book I really recommend. It pulls together a lot of the latest research on prehistoric daily life, including childhood, in a way that's surprisingly readable. You can find it through sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a discount running if you grab it there. It's a good way to turn all these scattered bones and broken pots into something that feels like real, breathing people. Because when we talk about the first farmers, we're not just talking about adults in fields, bent over grain. We're talking about kids learning to walk on dusty floors, small hands reaching for grinding stones, young voices repeating words for seeds, animals, and ancestors. The village isn't just a machine for producing food, it's a machine for producing new humans who know how to live this strange new settled life. The experiment of farming is really the experiment of raising children in one place long enough for them to call it home. If children are everywhere in these villages, so are the dead. And once you start paying attention to that, the whole settlement begins to look different. Religion, if we can even call it that yet, isn't something that happens in a separate building with a bell on top. It's baked into the walls, under the floors, and staring back at you from the plaster. Çatalhöyük is our best window into this world, and it's intense. Walk into one of those mudbrick houses 9,000 years ago. No streets outside, just other roofs. You drop down through the roof, opening into a single crowded room. On one wall the plaster has been smoothed and repainted again and again. Over time, people have built up a kind of shrine corner. Raised platforms, special benches, and what look like altars. On the walls there are paintings, red and black and white shapes. Repeating patterns, animals, massive bulls, deer, leopards, birds. Sometimes human figures, sometimes a tangle of limbs and spots that might be hunters surrounding prey. The paintings aren't just decoration. They're layered on top of older ones, scraped off and redone, like updating a story you keep telling. Then there are the bull horns. At Çatalhöyük, people sliced off the front of cattle skulls, keeping the horns and a bit of bone. They embedded these in the wall plaster and built them up into full three-dimensional shapes, so the horns thrust out into the room. Some houses have rows of them stacked like a whole herd embedded in the wall. Others have horns integrated into platforms, so that you're literally sitting or stepping next to symbolic cattle every day. What did it mean? We don't know. Archaeologists argue about it constantly. Maybe bulls were status symbols representing wealth in cattle, the way a fancy car might today. Maybe they were tied to male power, or to seasonal rituals around hunting or herding. Maybe the horned altars marked the house as belonging to a particular lineage, like a family crest. Or maybe the bull wasn't just an animal anymore. Maybe, in the stories told over those grinding stones, it had become a kind of spirit, dangerous, powerful, a being you could call on for strength or had to appease to avoid disaster. The bull isn't alone. The village is thick with animal imagery, stalking leopards, elegant deer, vultures with outstretched wings. Some scholars think these might map out a kind of spiritual ecosystem. Each animal stands for a force in the world: fertility, death, protection, wildness, maybe even specific places on the surrounding landscape. Then there are the figurines. At Neolithic sites across the Near East, we find small clay or stone figures. Many are female-bodied rounded hips, emphasized breasts and bellies. For a long time these were labelled Mother Goddess statues. The theory was that early farmers obsessed with fertility of crops and wombs worshipped a single great Earth Mother. Today that's much more contested. Some figurines are clumsy, quickly made, even broken and remade. They show up in trash pits and ordinary fill, not carefully placed on altars. Some look more like toys or teaching aids than sacred idols. Others are clearly crafted with care and found near special features, so they might have had ritual roles. Instead of one simple answer, we may be looking at many different uses for similar-looking objects. A clay figure could be a plaything in one context, a charm for safe birth in another, a stand-in for an ancestor in a third. In a world without writing, objects carry a lot of meanings at once. Ancestor veneration seems especially important. Remember those burials under the floors? Many Neolithic houses contain multiple skeletons, stacked or tucked into corners under platforms where people sleep and work. Sometimes, generations later, people reopened those graves, took out a skull and reburied the rest. The skull might be plastered and painted, given new skin and even shell eyes, then displayed in the house for a while before being buried again. It looks like the boundary between the living household and the dead, didn't run through a cemetery at the edge of town. It ran right through the middle of daily life. Your grandmother's head might literally be watching over the place where you grind grain. Your dead child might lie beneath the spot where you sleep. In that kind of setting, you don't just remember your ancestors. You live with them. Archaeologists think this constant physical presence of the dead could have been a way to anchor claims to the house, the fields, the lineage. But it may also have been deeply emotional. When you talk softly at night near the hearth, you might be talking to the living and the dead at the same time. Some researchers go further and see traces of shamanic practices. At Çatalhöyük, a few burials stand out, individuals with unusual objects or skeletons that show signs of repeated handling. Certain people may have been specialists at mediating between humans and the spirit world, leading house rituals, interpreting dreams, guiding ceremonies when someone died, or when the village needed rain. Wall paintings that show part human, part animal figures are sometimes interpreted as shamans in trance, becoming a bull or a leopard to travel into another realm. House roofs, with their ladders and smoke holes, might not just be practical architecture. In some traditional societies, roof openings are also symbolic routes for spirits to enter or leave. It's possible similar ideas were starting to form here. But again, we have to be careful. Every time we say shaman, we're importing ideas from much later and very different cultures. The bones and plaster don't tell us what people felt when they chanted, or whether they even chanted at all. To see how weird things can get, we can step away from the houses for a moment and look at a very different site, Göbekli Tepe. It's older than most farming villages built by hunter-gatherers or very early experimenters in cultivation. There, on a hilltop, people erected massive stone circles with towering T-shaped pillars. The pillars are carved with intricate animals, snakes, boars, birds, big cats, like a stone bestiary. There are no domestic houses around them. It looks like a place groups travelled to, not lived in. Whatever was happening at Göbekli Tepe was probably a kind of communal ritual on a huge scale. Feast remains suggest large gatherings. The architecture is monumental, meant to impress. If Çatalhöyük is religion woven into every room, Göbekli Tepe is religion as a separate destination, a pilgrimage site. By the time of our first true farming villages, those older hilltop sanctuaries are fading out. The ritual seems to move inward, into domestic space. The great stone pillars become bullhorns in your wall. The vast carved menagerie becomes the painted animals clustered above your sleeping platform. The public, communal spirit world collapses down into the house, the lineage, the ancestors under your feet. Or maybe that's the wrong way around. Maybe modest village shrines are just what we found so far, and somewhere out there, still buried, are Neolithic ceremonial centres we haven't stumbled on yet. That's the challenge of reading meaning into prehistoric symbols. For every bullhorn we can measure, there's a story about bulls that we can only guess at. For every figurine we can weigh, there's a whispered prayer or a child's joke that has vanished completely. What we can say is this: in the first villages, work and worship were not separate categories. You ground grain next to ancestor bones, you slept under painted vultures, you wove your children into a world where the living, the dead, the animals, and the unseen all crowded into the same small room. And tomorrow, when you wake up to tend the fields or feed the animals, that crowded spirit world comes with you. If the spirit world is crowding into every room, then art is one of the main ways people learn to see it. In these early villages, nobody is an artist in the modern sense. There are no galleries, no framed canvases, but everywhere you look, people are making marks, shaping things, adding a little extra to the bare minimum of survival. Take the figurines. We already mentioned those rounded female figures that show up all over the Neolithic Near East. Çatalhöyük gives us some of the most famous, including the so-called seated woman. She's small enough to sit in your hand, but her presence is not small. Heavy thighs and hips, full breasts, a soft, rounded belly. She's seated on what looks like a chair with big feline armrests, often interpreted as leopards. Her arms rest calmly on them, as if she's not just sitting but enthroned. Older books will confidently tell you she's a mother goddess, ruler of birth and harvest, maybe queen of the animals. Today, archaeologists are more cautious. Some point out that this kind of carefully made, elaborate figure is actually rare at Çatalhöyük. Most figurines are rough, quick, even a bit sloppy. The seated woman stands out precisely because so few objects were treated with that level of care. So what was she? We think she might have been used in specific rituals, maybe about fertility, maybe about abundance, maybe about the continuity of the house line. Some researchers notice that her body echoes the shape of a grain-filled storage bin, wide, full, promising food through the winter. Others connect the leopards to hunting or to prestigious animals that only some people had the right to control. But she could also be something simpler and more intimate, a particular ancestor remembered as powerful, or an idealized elder woman, or a kind of house spirit that embodied everything the family hoped for. What's striking is not that one figurine exists, but that entire villages are littered with their broken cousins. Clay women, clay animals, little lumps that might be people or might just be practice pieces. They show up in trash pits, in fill layers under floors, in corners that were never shrines. It looks like making small figures was part of everyday life. A thing you do while talking, teaching, waiting for bread to bake. A way kids learn to handle clay. A medium for play, for magic, for story. The walls are another canvas. At Çatalhöyük and other sites, plastered walls become places for repeated experiments in colour and pattern. People repaint and replaster them again and again. Under the final layer, archaeologists find ghost images of older designs, zigzags, chevrons, grids, animal silhouettes, handprints. Those handprints are particularly haunting. A palm pressed into wet plaster, fingers splayed. Sometimes they're painted, sometimes they're just the impression itself. A literal touch across 9 millennia. Were they makers signing their work? Children allowed to leave their mark? A ritual gesture saying, "This house is ours," or "We are here." Geometric patterns might seem less dramatic than a big bull or leopard, but they're important. Repeating chevrons, meanders, and cross-hatched bands suggest people weren't just painting what they saw, they were playing with abstraction, with rhythm, with symmetry. That kind of patterning is very close to the mental toolkit needed for weaving, counting, tracking time. Some motifs may have had encoded meanings, marks that said this is a special place, or this platform is where certain rituals happen, or this corner is associated with a particular ancestor or season. We can't read the code, but the consistency hints that it existed. Art doesn't just live on walls and in clay, it's on bodies too. Across early farming sites we find beads, lots of beads. Tiny stone cylinders, pierced shells, carved bone, little pieces of obsidian or limestone drilled through. Bead making takes time. You need to source material, shape it, polish it, pierce it. Nobody does that if they don't care how things look. Strings of beads, probably decorated hair, necks, wrists, maybe even clothing. Some graves elsewhere in the Neolithic world show people buried with hundreds or thousands of beads sewn onto garments that have since rotted away. In life, those outfits would have shimmered and clicked when the wearer moved. Pigments show up too. Lumps of red ochre, yellow earths, black charcoal. They're ground on special stones, stored carefully, sometimes found near burials, sometimes smeared on bones or plaster. Red is especially common on skulls, on walls, on objects. We think it might have symbolized blood, vitality, or transformation. But again, that's our guess layered over someone else's meaning. As for tattooing, direct evidence is tricky. Skin doesn't survive well. But we do find tools that could work as tattoo needles, fine bone points, sharpened obsidian flakes, and we know that many later farming and herding societies in the region practiced tattooing and body painting. It's very plausible that some of these Neolithic villagers walked around with patterned skin, darkened lines on faces and limbs, designs only visible when the clothes came off or when the right ritual called for it. None of this comes for free. The materials involved point to wider networks. Obsidian for blades and beads often comes from volcanic sources dozens or even hundreds of kilometers away. Certain shells found in inland villages once belonged to sea creatures. Some pigments matched distant deposits rather than local ones. To get them, people had to trade, travel, or maintain long-distance relationships. So when someone in your village wears a gleaming obsidian pendant, or paints a wall with a rare shade of red, they're not just showing taste. They're displaying connections to other places, other groups, other landscapes. Art becomes a visible map of social ties. Was all this religious? Social? Just decorative? Probably all of the above, often at the same time. A necklace might be pretty, but also mark you as part of a particular lineage. A painted bull might be a sacred symbol, a teaching tool for children learning about animals, and a way to make the house feel less bare. A figurine might be a toy today and a ritual offering tomorrow. In a world without writing, form and colour carry a huge load. They signal identity, remember stories, mark transitions, birth, puberty, marriage, death. They can soothe, intimidate, impress, or comfort. And as villages get denser and lives get more entangled, these layers of meaning get thicker. By the time you look around a Neolithic house, you're not just seeing mudbrick and tools. You're seeing a dense web of symbols on the walls, on the shelves, on people's bodies. You're living inside a story your community has been slowly decorating, repainting and revising for generations. That growing tangle of art and meaning doesn't just reflect the complexity of early village life. It helps create it. Once you start marking differences between houses, between lineages, between roles, you're halfway to something else. Status, identity, maybe even inequality. To see how that plays out, we have to follow the art and the ancestors into their final shared space. The graves beneath the floors, and what those burials tell us about who mattered most in the first villages. To understand what mattered most in these houses, you have to look down. Under the white plastered floors, beneath the sleeping platforms and work areas, archaeologists keep finding the same thing: people. In many early farming villages, the dead don't go off to a distant cemetery. They stay home. Bodies are placed in shallow pits, dug right into the packed earth of the house floor, often under the main platforms where people sit, sleep, and work every day. Picture this. Someone dies. Maybe a grandmother who has seen the village grow from a handful of houses to a tight, smoky maze. The family washes and arranges her body, then curls her into a flexed position, knees drawn up toward the chest. It's a posture that looks to modern eyes a lot like a fetus. We think that positioning might have been deliberate, returning the dead, in a kind of symbolic rebirth into the earth, or back into the womb of the house. Sometimes the bodies are on their side, sometimes on their back, often oriented in roughly similar directions within a given house, as if the community had rules, spoken or unspoken, about the proper way to lie among the ancestors. Grave goods are modest but telling. We see beads around necks and wrists, pendants, shells, stone tools, maybe a special blade or a grinding stone used so long its surface is polished from years of grain. A child might be buried with a bead belt or a small figurine. An adult might have a carefully knapped obsidian knife, or a necklace stitched together from dozens of tiny shells that once came from the sea far away. These aren't lavish treasure hoards. They look more like chosen pieces, objects that mattered to the person or to the family's memory of them. We think they might have marked roles, skills, or status. The good hunter, the expert grinder of grain, the woman whose shell necklace was a family heirloom. But not everyone gets the same treatment. Some individuals are buried singly, others are placed in clusters, one on top of another, separated by thin layers of soil and plaster. Over decades, a particular spot under a platform might accumulate a small crowd of ancestors, grandparents, parents, children, all stacked in a careful, remembered order. And then there are the skulls at several sites, including Jericho and Çatalhöyük. Archaeologists notice something strange: skeletons with missing heads, and elsewhere, isolated skulls buried by themselves, or even kept above ground for a time. In some cases, the heads seem to have been removed after the flesh had decayed, cut free from older burials, taken out of their original graves. Those skulls were then plastered over. Clay or lime plaster was modelled to rebuild cheeks, noses, even lips. Shells or painted stones were set into the eye sockets. Sometimes hair was indicated with paint or added material. These aren't anonymous skull piles. They look like attempts to recreate particular faces. We think these plastered skulls were displayed for a while, maybe kept in special niches, placed on benches, brought out for rituals. Imagine sitting in a dim interior, walls painted red, a low fire smouldering, and on a shelf above you, a row of ancestor faces, white plaster gleaming in the flicker. Were they terrifying, comforting, a bit of both? Some researchers see this as direct evidence of ancestor worship. The idea is that certain individuals, founders of house lines, powerful elders, maybe respected ritual specialists, didn't just vanish at death. They became ongoing members of the household, embodied in these skulls, receiving offerings, watching over the living, maybe mediating with the spirit world. Others are more cautious. They point out that not all skulls were treated this way. Most people, even in the same village, never had their heads plastered or displayed. So plastered skulls might mark a special category: chosen ancestors, symbolic founders, or even ritual objects that carried the identity of the house itself rather than straightforward portraits. Either way, the pattern is striking. Heads move. A headless skeleton lies quietly under a floor. Its skull, somewhere else, has a second career, handled, modelled, painted, curated, before eventually being reburied, sometimes in a group with other skulls. It's as if life, death, and memory are being disassembled and recombined through ritual. Differences in burial treatment hint at social differences too. Some graves are crowded with beads and rare materials, others are almost bare. Some houses accumulate many burials, others very few. In some villages, children are surprisingly well represented among the dead under floors, suggesting they were fully folded into house ancestry. In others, infants and small children seem to be treated differently, with burials in courtyards or in separate spots. We don't see anything like formal royal tombs here, no clear kings or queens. But we do see hints that not all ancestors were equal. Certain bodies, certain skulls, certain houses carry more ritual weight than others. That could reflect emerging status differences, the importance of particular lineages, or simply the varied ways people grieved and remembered. What's clear is that death doesn't break the relationship between person and place. It thickens it. Every new burial literally anchors another generation into the architecture. When you lie down at night, your bed is also a lid over decades of family history. When you plaster and repaint the floor, You are sealing in the dead and refreshing the space where the living will walk, cook, give birth, argue and tell stories. Over time, a house becomes a vertical archive. At the surface, daily life. Just below, layers of plaster, traces of old paintings, discarded tools. Deeper still, bodies in fetal curl, clusters of bones, skulls that once looked back with plaster eyes. We think this is how the first farmers stitched continuity into their risky new experiment. They had left a world of mobile camps and wide ranges, where memory travelled mainly in stories and paths on the landscape. In the village, memory sinks into walls and floors. Ancestors aren't out there in some distant sacred grove. They are right here, under the hearth, under the platform, under your feet. Every meal, every story, every argument plays out above them. The house isn't just a shelter, it's a machine for making ancestors and binding the living to them. And as those ancestral layers build up, so does something else, a sense that this house, this lineage, this patch of earth has deeper roots than its neighbours. The dead, it turns out, are not just company. They're also quiet partners in the slow rise of status, property and power in the world's first villages. If the dead are everywhere under the floors, the living are paying a price for that closeness too. When you pack people into mudbrick boxes, wall to wall, sharing air, water, tools, sleeping platforms, and yes, ancestor-filled floors, you don't just create community. You create an ecosystem for microbes. For most of human history before this, our ancestors lived in small, mobile groups. They walked away from their own waste, from rotting food, from parasite-infested sleeping spots. If someone got sick, there was a decent chance the illness burned out before it could infect many others, simply because there weren't many others around. In a village, that safety valve disappears. You've got dozens, maybe hundreds of people living cheek by jowl. Trash pits just outside the door. Animal pens crowded against house walls. Water sources that everyone shares. A roof that traps smoke and damp air. Archaeologists think this is when a lot of our familiar crowd diseases begin to find a foothold. Gut infections from contaminated water, respiratory illnesses that leap from person to person, parasites that thrive in bedding and on floors. We can't look directly at Neolithic germs, but we can see what they did. Some skeletons from early farming villages show signs of chronic infection, porous bone on the skull that might reflect repeated bouts of inflammation, lesions on the spine, and long bones that suggest long-term disease. In some burials, the bones of children are especially fragile and pitted, as if they struggled through repeated sickness before dying young. Teeth tell an even clearer story. Hunter-gatherer teeth, on average, are annoyingly good. Before farming, many skeletons show big, robust jaws with relatively few cavities. There's wear, there are chips, but not a lot of rot. Then come the farmers and their grain. Wheat, barley, millet, cereals become the backbone of the diet in many early villages. Grains are fantastic at feeding more people per acre. But once you grind them into flour, cook them into porridge or bread, and eat them day after day, they turn your mouth into a party venue for bacteria. Tooth after tooth from Neolithic skeletons shows cavities, abscesses, and heavy build-up of tartar. Some jaws have holes where infections burrowed through into the bone. In older adults, we sometimes see teeth worn down to the roots from years of chewing stone-dusted flour, the enamel literally sanded away by tiny bits of grit from grinding stones. And there's another clue in the teeth: linear enamel hypoplasias. These are faint horizontal grooves or pits that form when a child's body is under serious stress, malnutrition, disease, or both. The enamel stops growing properly for a while, then resumes when things improve. Many early village children carry these stress lines. little records of hard seasons etched permanently into their smiles. Their bones echo the same story. When archaeologists compare late hunter-gatherer skeletons to early farmers in the same regions, a rough pattern keeps turning up. The first farmers are often slightly shorter on average. Their bones sometimes show signs of anemia, thinned, spongy-looking skull roofs, possibly from iron-poor diets or repeated infections. Healed fractures cluster in familiar spots. Lower backs, knees, wrists and shoulders, all the places that suffer when your life is built around grinding, lifting, bending and carrying. Think about that daily grindstone work we've mentioned. The hours of kneeling, leaning forward, pushing grain across a rough stone. Over years that posture leaves marks. Some skeletons show arthritic changes in the knees and spine that start shockingly early in life. The same goes for people who spent decades hoeing fields, carrying loads of water, or herding animals over rough ground. Their joints bear the record of repetitive, specialized tasks that most foragers never did at that intensity. From a purely biological comfort perspective, a lot of foragers had it better. They ate a broader mix of foods: meat, fish, tubers, nuts, fruits, leafy greens. Their protein intake often seems higher, their micronutrient profile richer. Their bones show fewer signs of chronic stress in some regions, and their teeth, while worn, are less ravaged by sugar-feeding bacteria. So why didn't people just walk away from the villages and go back to that? Because farming came with a different kind of payoff: numbers. Even if each individual farmer was, on average, a bit shorter, a bit sicker, and more likely to spend their old age with aching joints and missing teeth, the village as a whole could support more people on the same land. Grain fields and herds of sheep or goats acted as calorie amplifiers. You could turn a patch of valley floor into food for many families, not just one roaming band. Archaeologists think this is the core paradox of early agriculture. At the scale of a single body, the change often looks like a downgrade. At the scale of a population, it's a power-up. More babies survive to adulthood, even if childhood is rough. More people can cluster together, defend territory, pass on traditions, and outcompete neighbouring foragers for land and resources. And within all this, people aren't just passive victims of disease and injury. They're experimenting with ways to fight back. Some skeletons show signs of healed trauma that would have been fatal without care. Badly broken bones that were set and left to mend, skull injuries that knit back together. That implies people were immobilized, fed and protected while they healed. Somebody stayed home with the wounded, brought them food, cleaned them, changed their bandages, even if we can't see those bandages now. We also see hints of early medicine in the plants. Residues in pottery and on grinding stones sometimes include seeds and herbs that aren't obviously food staples, but do have medicinal properties in later traditional systems. Plants that reduce pain, calm the stomach, fight fevers, or help with childbirth. We can't always prove Neolithic villagers were using them as drugs, but it would be surprising if they didn't experiment. When you live intimately with the landscape, you learn what plants do. At some sites, traces of trepanation, holes deliberately cut or scraped into the skull, appear slightly later in prehistory, suggesting attempts to treat head injuries, seizures, or intense headaches by literally opening the bone. Even in the earlier Neolithic, we already see a mindset that doesn't just accept suffering. It tries to manipulate the body to intervene. So, inside these early houses, life is a bundle of trade-offs. You gain ancestors under your floor, a tight network of kin and neighbours, fields and herds that buffer you some years from starvation. You also gain cavities, bad backs, childhood fevers that sweep through crowded rooms, and parasites that love warm village dirt. Yet the experiment keeps spreading. Villages get bigger. More appear, Foragers on the fringes start planting patches of grain or keeping a few animals. The cost of settling down is high, measured in bones and teeth and shortened lives, but the payoff is a kind of strength that only numbers and permanence can give. And once those numbers are in place, another set of pressures starts to build, pressures that play out not in bodies, but in relationships. Because when more people live closer together, sharing land and water and ancestors, conflict and cooperation both become much harder to avoid. More people, more problems. In a small foraging band, if you really can't stand someone, you can walk away. Move your camp. Drift toward another group. Space is the safety valve. In a village, that safety valve slams shut. Your field is here. Your animals are here. Your ancestors are literally under your floor. You and the neighbour you can't stand. You're both staying. So what happens when things go wrong? Archaeologists start by looking at bones. Some Neolithic skeletons show blunt force trauma to the skull, broken noses, forearms with parry fractures that look like someone raised an arm to block a blow. A lot of those injuries are healed. That suggests arguments, fights, maybe ambushes, but not constant one-sided slaughter. We think interpersonal violence was real, probably familiar, but not yet the industrial-scale warfare of later cities. Burned layers in some early settlements muddy the water. When we find a village with a thick band of ash, collapsed walls and smashed pottery, was that an enemy attack? Or just a fire in a town made of wood, thatch and dry mudbrick? Sometimes we do get clearer hints. At a handful of early European farming sites, slightly later than our 9,000-year window, archaeologists have found mass graves with crushed skulls and broken limbs, bodies dumped in pits without ceremony. Those look a lot like massacres, but in the very first villages in the Near East, the picture is quieter, more ambiguous. Violence is there, but full-blown organised warfare with armies, campaigns and fortified front lines may not yet have taken shape. And then there's Jericho. About 9,000 years ago, Jericho is one of the largest settlements anyone has ever built. A few hundred people, maybe more, clustered around a spring in the Jordan Valley. And wrapped around part of that community is a serious wall. In front of it, a deep ditch cut into bedrock. Inside the wall, a tall stone tower rising above the houses. If you've ever heard of the walls of Jericho, you might assume we're talking about a fortress. A fortification against enemy villages, raiders, or some early version of an army. Some archaeologists agree. They point to the thickness of the wall. The labour needed to quarry and stack those stones. The way the ditch could slow anyone approaching from outside. If you're worried about people with spears, this is not a bad response. But others aren't convinced. There's no clear evidence of weapons embedded in the wall. No obvious signs of siege. The wall might have been built less for fighting neighbours and more for fighting nature, holding back flash floods rushing in from the wadi, controlling erosion, marking the edge of the habitable mound. And the tower? It's a puzzle all on its own. It's connected to the wall, but it doesn't function like a classic watchtower. Some researchers think it could have been an early prestige project, a symbol of community identity or power. Others have noticed how the stairs inside align with the setting sun at certain times of year, and suggest it might have been part of seasonal rituals, a place where people processed up and down during ceremonies, tying the village to the sky. Whatever its purpose, one thing is certain. You don't get a wall and a tower like that without serious cooperation. Quarrying stone, hauling it, stacking it into a stable structure, several meters high, this isn't two cousins working over a weekend. This is dozens of people, maybe the whole community, organised around a common project that lasts months or years. Someone has to coordinate who cuts stone, who carries water for the builders, who keeps children out of the work area, who brings food. Fields still need tending, animals still need grazing. The whole social system has to flex to make room for monumental labour. That level of cooperation doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It rests on everyday habits, sharing tools, lending a hand with a roof repair, trading help at harvest time. It also rests on some system, formal or informal, for making decisions. We don't see thrones or palaces in these early villages. There's no obvious king of Jericho striding around with a scepter. But to pull people into a massive building project, somebody's voice has to carry weight. Maybe it's elders who've lived through floods before and insist the wall is necessary. Maybe it's ritual specialists who claim to know what the ancestors or the spirits want. Maybe leadership shifts with the task. One person good at organising field work, another good at settling disputes, another good at planning ceremonies. Those disputes would have been constant. Land is suddenly not an abstract thing you move across. It's your family's field, your neighbour's field, the fallow strip everyone grazes animals on, the path to the well. What happens when your goats wander into someone else's barley? When a ditch you dig for irrigation steals water from the plot downstream? When a tree everyone uses for firewood is cut down by one impatient household? We don't have written records of Neolithic court cases, but we can imagine the scenes. Raised voices in an alley, a handful of elders or respected adults stepping in, listening to both sides, proposing compensation, so many baskets of grain, a lamb, help at harvest. In many small-scale farming societies we can observe today, social pressure and reputation are powerful tools. If you get a name as the person who never cooperates, who steals water or refuses to contribute to communal work, life becomes very uncomfortable. Invitations stop. Favours dry up. Early villages probably ran on similar invisible politics. Your household is its own economic engine, your own fields, your own storage jars, your own animals, but your survival depends on everyone else too. You need neighbours when you're sick, allies when a dispute breaks out, extra hands when a roof collapses or a flood threatens the wall. So there's a constant balancing act between mine and ours. Households invest in private storage built into floors and walls, but at the same time, we see large communal spaces in some villages, open courtyards, shared ovens, special buildings that don't look quite like houses. These might have been places where groups gathered to grind grain together, share feasts, hold meetings, or perform rituals that smoothed over tensions. Because as village populations grow, the strain on cooperation grows with them. A cluster of 10 houses can probably manage conflict with gossip and the occasional shouted argument. A settlement of 100 houses needs more structure, clearer norms about who controls which patch of land, who speaks for the group in dealing with outsiders, how big projects get decided and organised. We start to see hints of social differentiation, houses slightly larger than others, storage facilities that might serve more than one family, prestige items like special obsidian blades, or fancy stone axes clustered in some dwellings more than others. That doesn't automatically mean rigid classes or chiefs, but it does suggest that influence and access to resources were starting to vary. From the ground, it might have felt like this. Daily life is still about sowing and reaping, feeding children, mending tools. But hovering behind it all is a dense web of obligations and expectations. Help with the wall building, and the village has your back when your harvest fails. Skimp on irrigation duty, and find your requests ignored when you need help defending your herd. In that sense, politics in the first villages wasn't a separate sphere. It was baked into who shared your oven, who helped you raise your roof, who stood beside you in an argument over a boundary stone. And those same connections stretched outward beyond the village itself, because no community, however self-sufficient it seems, is completely alone. The first farmers were already looking past their walls and fields, making contact with other groups, trading goods, ideas, and probably stories about who they were and how they should live together. If you're standing in one of these villages, it might feel like the whole world is right here. Your fields, your animals, your neighbours, your ancestors under the floor. But if you look closely at what people are actually using and wearing, a different picture appears. On a mat in one house, an archaeologist finds a razor-sharp black blade. It's obsidian, volcanic glass that fractures into edges sharper than steel. The nearest source? Not the creek bed outside. Sometimes it's a mountain 100 kilometers away. Sometimes it's an extinct volcano across what would have been serious travel routes. Again and again in early farming villages in Anatolia and the Levant, we find obsidian that geochemists can trace back to specific volcanoes in central or eastern Anatolia. That means one of two things. Either someone from this village walked or rode and traded their way all the way out there and back, or that obsidian moved hand to hand, village to village, like a slow-motion relay race across the landscape. We don't see caravans painted on the walls, but we do see patterns. The farther you get from a particular obsidian source, the less common and more carefully curated those blades tend to be. Near the volcano, people might be flaking big chunks, using them for everyday tools. Hundreds of kilometers away we find smaller pieces, sometimes resharpened to the point of exhaustion, tucked into houses alongside other prestige items. That looks a lot like a supply chain, and it isn't just obsidian. At some inland sites, archaeologists uncover small shells from Mediterranean or Red Sea species, drilled as beads. In highland villages, they find pigments and minerals that come from lowland riverbeds or distant cliff faces, exotic greenstones, special flints, sometimes even worked pieces of soft stone that match deposits far beyond the local valley. Each of these is a little breadcrumb, hinting at journeys taken and relationships maintained. So how did these things travel? We have a few models. One is the idea of the specialist traveller, certain individuals or families who were particularly mobile, moving between communities, carrying goods, stories, and news. They might have been the Neolithic equivalent of peddlers, or marriage partners moving from one village to another, and bringing valuables with them as part of bride wealth or dowry. Another is down-the-line exchange. You don't need any one person to walk the whole distance from volcano to coast. A hunter in the foothills trades a lump of obsidian for grain with a farmer. That farmer's cousin takes a portion to another village and swaps it for shells or a polished stone axe. Over years, maybe generations, the materials hopscotch across the landscape without any individual travelling very far. Archaeologists tend to think both happened, and that which pattern dominates may have shifted over time and place. Some sites show evidence of local workshops where imported obsidian was turned into finished tools for redistribution. Others suggest that what arrived was already worked, more like high-end imports than raw material. Either way, your isolated mudbrick village is plugged into a network. These trade links aren't just economic. They tell us something about social relationships too. To move goods across multiple communities, you need trust. You need some expectation that if you set out along a known route, the people you meet will at least recognize the idea of exchange, rather than simply seeing you as a target. You might need shared rituals, shared myths about common ancestors, or at minimum, shared etiquette, how to greet strangers, what counts as an insult, what makes a fair trade. We suspect that inter-village relationships were stitched together partly through marriage. A daughter from your village marries into a community 2 days' walk away. Suddenly you have in-laws there, a place you're welcomed, people who will host you if you arrive with a bag of surplus grain, and an eye on their obsidian knives. Gift exchange may have been just as important as straightforward barter. In many small-scale societies today, prestigious items, rare stones, finely made blades, unusual shells, circulate as gifts in rituals, feasts, and alliance building. You don't give them away to lose wealth, you give them to create obligations, to weave other families more tightly into your own survival. But contact was never risk-free. Leaving your valley meant walking into territories where people might not know your name or your intentions. A stranger approaching a village with a pack on their back could be an opportunity, new materials, gossip from afar, a potential ally. Or they could be a threat, a scout for raiders, a carrier of disease, someone whose demands for hospitality strain your own precarious supplies. We think Neolithic farmers navigated this tension through a mix of caution and ritual. Maybe you stop outside the cluster of houses, shout a standardized greeting, lay your goods on a rock where everyone can see you're carrying stone and shells, not weapons. Maybe there are shared songs or gestures that mark you as one of us, even if you live days away. The rewards were enough to keep people taking that risk. Exotic goods weren't just pretty, they did social work. An obsidian blade in your household might cut better, but it also says something about your connections. Shell beads on a child, an unusual pigment on a burial, a polished axe made from far-travelled stone. All of these advertise that your family is tied into larger networks, that you have friends, allies, maybe distant kin beyond the next ridge. For a community living at the mercy of weather, pests, and crop failure, that wider web could be a lifeline. If your harvest fails, who can you turn to? The villages you've traded with for years? The cousins you married off to strangers by the far volcano? The people who remember that time you brought obsidian when their sickles were worn thin? So when you picture daily life in the first villages, don't imagine a closed little bubble cut off from the rest of humanity. Imagine a landscape dotted with small communities, each with its own fields and feasts and arguments, but threaded together by paths of footsteps and stories, by beads and blades moving from hand to hand. By the time our farmer lies down at night, the obsidian knife by the hearth and the shell beads in the storage pit are quiet reminders that this mudbrick room is part of a much larger world, one you might someday walk out and see for yourself. As the sun slid down toward the horizon, that larger world started to fade from view, and the village folded back in on itself. Light changed first. The flat, white glare of midday softened into long shadows. Tasks that needed sharp eyes, sorting grain, weaving fine thread, picking out tiny weed seeds from stored lentils were the first to stop. Others didn't end so much as slow down. Someone might still be grinding grain at the quern, but now with a rhythm that says, enough for tonight, not we're feeding the whole household for days. We think evenings in these villages were a gradual unwinding rather than a hard stop. Animals were brought in close, penned in courtyards or small byres. Tools were wiped, stacked, maybe hung on pegs near the hearth. Fires that had been kept low and practical during the day were built up for warmth and light. Smoke thickened under the roof, curling toward the ceiling where it would eventually seep through thatch, vents or cracks in the mudbrick. And then, like clockwork, came the meal. Evening was probably the main shared meal of the day, especially in seasons when fieldwork pushed everyone out early. Archaeologists find large cooking pots, big enough to hold stew for a whole family or more, with carbonized residues that look like mixtures of grains, pulses, and animal fats. You can imagine what that means in lived experience. Someone stirring a pot of wheat or barley porridge, enriched with lentils, maybe flavoured with herbs, maybe thickened with a bit of goat milk, maybe with shreds of meat from a recently slaughtered sheep. We don't know exactly how formal these meals were, but the distribution of hearths and benches in some houses suggests that people arranged themselves in fairly consistent patterns. Elders near the warmest spots, children tucked where they could be watched while they ate and dozed, guests, when present, likely seated where everyone could see them, a small daily theatre of hospitality and hierarchy. Once everyone had something in their hands, a wooden bowl, a chunk of bread, a handful of grains. The village would have looked and sounded very different from the workday. This is where many researchers think the storytelling began. We don't have Neolithic audio recordings, but we do have analogies. In small-scale societies around the world, the hours after the evening meal are prime time for narrative, myths, family histories, practical tales about how to behave and what happens if you don't. The archaeological hints line up. These were communities already investing in ancestors, in ritual, in symbols painted on walls and carved into bone. That kind of symbolism doesn't just live in silence. So picture it. The glow of multiple hearths leaking out into the lanes, voices overlapping as households talk through the day. Maybe one house is unusually loud tonight because someone is retelling the story of that dangerous hunt, or the time a cousin came back from a far-off village with obsidian that glittered like captured lightning. Children hear the same tales so often they can anticipate the punchlines, and in the process they absorb the rules and values of their world. Stories didn't have to be long myths either. Gossip is its own genre of oral tradition. Who traded what, who argued with whom, whose field is doing badly, who might be pregnant. Archaeologists believe this nightly exchange of information could be as crucial as any formal ritual in knitting the community together and helping people navigate alliances, debts, and obligations. And then there's sound that isn't speech. At some early farming sites, we find flutes made from bird bones, with carefully spaced holes drilled along their length. At others there are clay rattles, sometimes shaped like animals, sometimes just simple ovoids with pebbles sealed inside. We see pierced animal teeth, shells and small stones that would have clacked or jingled when worn. None of that proves organized concerts, but it does tell us music was part of this world. We think evenings are the most likely time when these sound-making tools came out. After the labour of the day, after people had eaten and the fields were disappearing into darkness, there was room for other rhythms. Someone might tap out a beat on an upturned pot, shake a rattle to quiet a fussy child, or play a short melody on a flute that everyone recognizes. Communal singing, simple refrains everyone can join, would be a powerful way to reaffirm belonging in a universe that could seem vast and unpredictable. The same fire that lit the songs also shaped the night's comfort. Sleeping conditions in these houses weren't private, and they weren't soft by our standards. Archaeologists uncover raised platforms along walls built of packed earth and sometimes coated in plaster. On top of these, people probably laid reed mats, wool or goat hair textiles, maybe piles of skins and furs in colder months. Whole families would have shared these spaces. Parents, children, perhaps grandparents, and sometimes infants who had not yet survived long enough to be named. That kind of sleeping arrangement changes how you experience the end of the day. You don't retreat into a sealed-off room. You lie down within arm's reach of half your social universe. You fall asleep to the sound of your sister's breathing, your father's cough, the small shifting noises of animals just beyond the wall. Warmth is collective, not individual. Your body heat is part of the household heating system. In winter, fire mattered even more. Some houses may have kept embers going all night in a central hearth, carefully banked to reduce smoke and prevent flare-ups. Others might have relied on residual heat, stored in thick mudbrick walls and platforms heated through the day. Blankets were not decorative, they were survival technology. The decision of who slept where was likely about age, health, and status, but also pure thermodynamics. The youngest and most frail closest to the warmest spots. Over all of this lay a slower rhythm than day and night, the turning of the seasons. What evening felt like in a village depended on when in the year you were experiencing it. During harvest, evenings might be short and exhausted, people eating quickly and collapsing, muscles aching from long days cutting, bundling, and carrying. In the quieter months when fields lay fallow and tasks were more about maintenance than crisis, evenings could stretch out, giving more room for storytelling, music, and perhaps craft work done by firelight. Archaeologists see seasonal patterns in the bones of animals when they were slaughtered, how old they were, as well as in plant remains. These suggest times of plenty and times when food was stretched thin. We can imagine that in lean months the emotional texture of evening shifted. Laughter might be tinged with anxiety. Stories might turn more often to ancestors who survived hard years, or to rituals meant to coax favour from the spirits of land and weather. Still, there's something steady here too. No matter how successful the harvest, every day ended with this same gathering near the hearth, the same shared meal, the same gradual dimming of talk as people lay down and closed their eyes. If mornings in the first villages were about uncertainty, what will the weather do? Will the fields hold? Will the animals stay healthy? Then evenings were about a kind of fragile reassurance. You had made it through another cycle of work and risk. The clay walls around you, the bodies beside you, the faint smell of cooked grain and wood smoke in your hair. All of it said, for tonight at least, the experiment of settled life is still working. Tomorrow, when the light returns, it will all begin again. If you zoom out from that single evening, from that one moment of everyone finally lying down, you can start to see the larger shape of a life in these first villages. Morning wasn't just about waking up, it was the daily confrontation with risk. Checking the sky, looking over the fields, counting the animals. Every day started with questions. Will the grain ripen? Will the herd stay healthy? Will we have enough to make it through the next lean season? The hours in between were filled with the repetitive, unglamorous work that actually keeps people alive. Digging, weeding, hauling water, grinding grain until your shoulders burned. Watching children, patching walls, tending fires, cutting fodder. We think a life in these early farming communities was less about dramatic events and more about a constant low-level negotiation with soil, weather, animals and other people. Evening wrapped that work in meaning. Shared meals, stories, rituals, the quiet decisions about who sleeps where and who eats what, those weren't just background details. They were how these small clusters of mud brick and thatch became something more than piles of houses. They turned a fragile economic experiment into a social world people were willing to defend, invest in, and pass on to their children. From a distance of 9,000 years, it's easy to see these villages as primitive prologues to real civilization. But archaeologists increasingly think the opposite is true. The things that would later define cities and states, stored surplus, trade networks, inherited land, social rules, shared symbols, are already taking shape here. When someone learns a better way to line a storage pit, when a neighbour experiments with a new crop, when a child absorbs the story of how their ancestors first came to this place, the foundations of later kingdoms and empires are quietly being poured. And yet none of this was smooth or guaranteed. Early village life seems to have been a constant blend of hardship and innovation. Fields failed. Diseases spread more easily in close quarters. Conflicts over water or land could turn bitter. But people also invented new tools, new social arrangements, new rituals to cope with uncertainty. They were paying a high price for settled life, and at the same time, they were unlocking possibilities, population growth, specialization, long-distance exchange that wandering bands could never quite reach. We live in a world built on their experiment. Every time you turn a key in a door, plan around a harvest from halfway across the planet, or sit under a roof you didn't personally build. You're moving through problems they were the first to wrestle with. How to live together in one place. How to share and store and remember. If you enjoyed wandering through their day with me, you can help this channel grow by liking this video, subscribing, and leaving a comment. It really does make a difference, and I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Tell me in the comments which part of the world you're in as you imagine these first villages. If this glimpse into deep time has made you curious for more, there's a book about prehistoric secrets waiting for you at sleepytimehistory.com, where we dive even further into the strange experimental lives of our ancestors. 9,000 years ago, someone much like you lay down on a hard plastered platform, listening to the last coals settle in the hearth, wondering what tomorrow's weather would bring. We can't ask them what they dreamed about, but we can keep tracing the faint marks they left behind, following their stories as far back as the evidence will let us. As long as we keep asking how they lived and why they changed their world the way they did, the deep past stays open, not as a distant, finished chapter, but as an ongoing mystery we're still learning how to read.